So now I'm going to talk briefly about if you want to establish a healthy tree, what are some of the things to think about, and I'll talk about some of the potential alternatives, different species that you might consider. This is a situation where they only had room for one tree, and this tree is not very healthy. This is not what you want. This is not a success. In this situation, actually some of this could have been prevented. This tree actually has what we call girdling roots that are actually starting to grow around the stem. And I didn't bring the picture, but when this person was trying to diagnose the problem, I said, send me a picture of the stem, and they did, and you can actually see the roots growing right into the trunk of the tree, and that actually suffocates the tree. But when we plant trees, sometimes we can identify those roots and actually prune them before we plant a tree, so to prevent that. The other thing is sometimes if we plant trees too deep, and I'm going to talk about planting depth in a little bit, but if we plant them too deep, the tree adjusts to that and actually puts on new roots called amphititious roots out of its trunk, and those can sometimes grow around and actually create stem girdling roots. So if you prepare your tree properly for planting and plant it at the correct depth, you can avoid something like this. So growing healthy trees, this is what we want. This is a beautiful shade tree. This happens to be a red oak. Very nice tree. This tree is probably only 20 years old. A lot of people think oak don't grow very fast, but especially like red oak can grow pretty fast. Beautiful shaped tree. I have two of those in my neighborhood. That's not my house. I wish it was. But that's a very nice shade tree. But that's what we're trying. If we do things correctly, obviously certain things can happen out of our control. But if we plan correctly, a lot of times we can avoid a lot of the problems that people have 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road because we avoided or we didn't quite do things right or we went the wrong direction. So we can avoid problems in a lot of cases. So what are some of the things? The thing I want you to think about is if you're going to plant a new tree, don't go in the situation and say, I want a linden tree there, or I want an oak tree there. What this basically says is you need to evaluate all these conditions, and you need to see what's going to fit best in the area that you want to plant a tree. So you need to look at the soils. Are they well drained versus poorly drained? Because even if it's poorly drained, there are some species, tree species, that could work in that situation. So you could still plant some trees. See how much sun you have. I mean, if you don't have more than 50% sunlight during the day, there's a number of trees that like full sun, and they're not going to grow well in shade. But there are some species that can tolerate some shade and do very well. So it's important to know what that is. And then also just the aspect, is this on the north side of the house versus the south side of the house? The south in the wintertime gets a lot more sun, can heat up, and there's certain species, I can tell you, like Serviceberry, Redbud, they don't like a southwest facing, they don't like that heat in the summertime or even in the wintertime. They like a northeast or eastern side where they're protected. They're actually trees that grow native in our woodlands on kind of shaded edges and stuff like that. So you want to place them where they're going to do well. The other thing is to look at utilities and look up. I still go into communities and I see a beautiful shade tree planted and I look up and just 10 feet this way is a power line. And I know in 25 years they're going to go zing and they're going to cut that off on that side and that tree's not going to look very good. So if that's the only place you have to plant, then there are smaller trees that you may be able to plant in that situation. If you have a driveway, think about, you may not want a small, like a crabapple or something coming out of the driveway that you can't prune up and visually see for safety. So think about all those things ahead of time. The other thing is, and I have it on here, you need to call Iowa 1 call before you dig, 811. That's the law. Before you, even though you swear you know where all the wires are and the cables, if you're going to do any digging in your yard in Iowa, you're required to call that you got to give them 2 working days during the week before they can do your locates and stuff. So once you look at all that stuff and see how much space you have, then you can start thinking about selection. I did bring a publication from the DNR. It talks about selecting trees, and it's basically alternatives to maple, and we'll talk about why that doesn't mean you can't plant a maple, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But think about, I see a lot of situations where people love like spruce trees or pine trees as foundation plants, but they plant them right next to the house on the corner, and those trees want to get 50 feet tall, and they want to get 35 feet wide. And then they'll call 10 years later and say, well, can I cut the top out and stuff because it's starting to want to go through the windows and do this? I can't believe I'm saying this, but there are evergreens that would even fit that situation. There's these things called dwarf conifers. They're smaller trees that, pine, spruce, firs, that if you only have something that can only get 8 feet tall, a lot of times there's plants that may fit your situation. So really evaluate that site, because to me, by doing this at the beginning, again, you can avoid a lot of the problems 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Okay. And then plant diversity, and I'll talk about that. And question is, why diversity? Well, it's very simple. The theme of this talk, I can say a couple things. Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, and we got another one coming, Asian longhorn beetle. The Asian longhorn beetle loves maple. That's one reason we're looking at alternatives to maple. In Iowa, we've been doing some studies in small communities. We've done about 300, mostly in eastern Iowa, where we've gone and literally GPS every public tree in these communities, like Lisbon and Solon and North Liberty. And out of that 300, the average community has about 17% ash on their just their public trees, but most communities have 34 to 37% maple. So most of these communities have over 50% just maple and ash. So we know what happened in the 50s and 60s with Dutch elm. This is our next Dutch elm coming here with emerald ash borer. We have over 3 million ash trees in our communities, and we have over 50 million throughout the state in our woodlands. A large percentage of those ash trees are going to die over the next 5 to 30 years, whatever it is. There's going to be a lot of loss of a lot of trees, just like when we lost the elms. So diversity is not 5 different types of oaks or 5 different types of maple or 5 different types of pine. But here, I mean, they have a spruce. This is a maple. This is a white pine. I think that's actually an oak. I'm not sure about that one. And they actually have a catalpa right here too. So they have 4 or 5 different genuses, not just species, but different genera of trees. And the thing we found is a lot of these diseases and insects are often not generalists, they're specific. So far, the emerald ash borer has gone mostly for ash, but there's been a tree called a fringe tree in Ohio, which is in the same family as ash. They've actually found it on this fringe tree in Ohio. So it might jump to species within the same family, but so far in their tests, it hasn't jumped to oak and walnut and some of those other species. But there's not a lot of, like Asian longhorn beetle has, I think 20 plus hosts, but one of its favorite is maple, but it doesn't like oak, and it doesn't like linden. So again, if you have a lot of diversity, and I know if you were like the one house I showed, you only have room for 1 tree, that's a tougher situation. But if you have room for more, the more diversity, and that's important in our communities. And our communities are really starting to do this. In Iowa City on McAllister Street down by Terry Trueblood, they just planted a bunch of trees, and there's probably 7 different species in there. So they're really mixing it up that if they have a problem, they're not going to lose everything. That's our best. I lose a lot of sleep at night because of all these bugs and diseases. I have nightmares about them. But our only defense is diversity. It really is. Our only true defense is to try to diversify, because we know how important trees are. So we need to keep planting them, but we need to diversify. So like I said, make sure before you plant. This is just a little commercial on bigger is not always better when you're planting trees. So when people are going to buy trees and stuff, they think, well, I'm going to buy the biggest I can because I'm getting older and I want to watch it grow, and I'm not going to wait for one this small because it's not going to get big enough, okay? Well, this is actually in Iowa City. This is a number of years ago, but this is the size of the tree that they planted. That tree was probably 18 feet tall when they planted it. I came back 4 years later, that's the same tree. It's not much bigger. So bigger is not always better, because a lot of times the thing you need to think about is if they're digging that up like ball and burlap or even spading it, you might lose 50 to 60% of the root system when you dig that. Even if they do it all by the right calculations and specs and stuff, they still lose a lot of root system. So they often say for every inch of caliper that you have or diameter, you have usually about a year shock that those roots need to get readjusted and stuff like that. So the bigger, the more shock. And if you just look at developments around town where they bring in a lot of bigger trees and you look at some of those developments 5, 6 years later, you see a lot of stressed trees a lot of times. I mean, there are some trees that do well because the nurseries do their best to do it right, but bigger is not always better. So even having a tree that's maybe an inch or even a half inch or a quarter of an inch in diameter, that tends to have a better root system in balance with the top. So a lot of times that tree is going to sit there a lot less time before it starts growing. It's going to do better. And I've seen situations, and I don't expect you to plant little seedlings, but I can plant little seedlings that we plant in the forest in my job. And I planted some seedlings at Lake McBride, and we planted them. I have one planting that we planted 3 years ago. So this is the third growing season. I have some 8 to 9 foot oak trees already in 3 years from a little seedling because it had a good root system. Didn't have a lot of shock. Now again, I don't expect you to plant seedlings, but something a little more in balance I think is pretty critical to, so bigger is not always better. But if you're going to go a little bigger, you can get trees tree spaded or ball and burlap. You can do that. But if you're using tree spades, a bigger tree spade, the better. So if it's a lot bigger than the root or than the tree, that means it's picking up more root system. So that helps too. And trees that size too are often cheaper, and if you want to plant them yourself, they're easier to handle if they're in a pot or something like that. So if you want to do it yourself, it's a lot easier to work with. Because a lot of times those big ball and burlap, they need a excavator or something to even pick them up to get them set in the ground correctly and straight and all that. It can be pretty hard to plant. So proper planting. This is really critical. There's been a lot of research probably in the last 10 years on planting, and kind of related to some problems that we had in some states to windstorms and different things, and some people started doing some research. But on the tree, this little area here is called the, basically it's the root collar or trunk collar, basically where the trunk meets the root. That area is the depth that you want that tree. So that root flare, if you look at trees that have been in the ground for a long time in our parks and stuff, they'll have that root that really flares out, okay? If you go to a landscape and you see a tree that looks like a telephone pole in the ground and there's no flare to that tree in the ground, that tree was planted too deep. And the reason that's a concern is a gentleman up in Minnesota, Gary Johnson, who's a researcher up there in urban forestry and nurseries and stuff like that, they had a windstorm up there a number of years ago, and they noticed a lot of trees snapped off. So they started investigating these trees, and what they found, a lot of them, they had these stem girdling roots that I was talking about earlier. And as they actually pulled the soil away, they noticed a lot of those trees were planted. The root flares were down anywhere from 2 inches to 8 to 10 inches below grade. So the other thing we find is if a lot of times people will call and say, my tree is 18 years old, and the last couple years it leaves out, but it leaves out later and later, and then in the fall it drops its leaves earlier and earlier. And it's been doing that the last couple years, and it's starting to kind of die at the top. First question I ask is, does it have a flare, or does it look like a pole in the ground? And 9 times out of 10, it has a pole, looks like a pole, and even after 15 years, that tree, depending on species, can start to decline if it was planted too deep 10 to 15 years before. Because where that root flare is where they're There's air exchange cells, and some species can't take being planted too deep. And so they'll grow for a while and they'll look like they're fine, but even 10 years later, they can start to have problems. Or if they're planted too deep, again, they could get those stem girdling roots that will start to girdle the trunk and then cause dieback in the tree. So that root flare is really critical. So when you get a tree, instead of planting it in the depth that it comes from the nursery, nurseries are working at this really hard, but the first thing you want to do is actually find that root flare. And here you can see the root starting to flare out. That's the depth. Well, that was the soil line. That tree was 2 to 3 inches too deep in the pot. So if you would have planted it, you would have planted that tree too deep. And 10, 15, 20 years down the road, that tree could have had some serious issues and started to decline. Again, nurseries are working at this, but we can do some preventative things ourselves to try to prevent damage or problems later. And that's one of the things that you want to find. And then, once you find that, then you measure from here down to the bottom of the pot, and that's the depth that you dig your hole. Then you dig your hole. And that's how deep you dig it. Because if you dig it too deep, before you measure that, you'll never pack it in enough. And then when you plant it, it could settle and then end up too deep. So it's important to measure that first and then dig the depth. And if we go back to this, the big thing is wide. The wider you can go this way and rough that soil up, the better. Because you're working up this area kind of like a garden. So those roots are going to have a better chance to get out. And if you have a tough soil, the best way to do it is the more that you go this way, because the thing you got to remember is the tree roots are in the top probably 6 to 24 inches. And that's where they want to be. And in some of our soils, the root depth may only be 10 inches. Some of our urban soils and stuff are compacted. They may not be able to go deeper than 10 or 12 inches. So working that area up so those roots can get out this way is key to giving them a better chance, okay? And again, I see eyes with questions, but we'll get to them towards the end. So this is one at proper depth. You can actually see, I just pulled the mulch away a little bit. You can actually see that root flare. They did a great job. And sometimes you got to be careful with urban trees, because if you see this, you think that's the flare, but that's actually the graft. You'll see that on apple trees and fruit trees, but even our urban trees are sometimes bud grafted or grafted onto a rootstock. And so you'll get this graft union, but you still look for those roots, and that's the depth that you want to plant it at. So you just want to cover up that flare, or just cover up those first roots, okay? So this is a tree that was in a planting, and I started digging. And I've already gone the length of that pin, and I still haven't found a root yet. So that tree was planted too deep. But luckily, I was inspecting it. We dug it up and started over. But, I mean, that tree had been planted like 6 days before I looked at it. So, I mean, it was easy for them to redo it. But if it had been in there a couple years, that may be that's a lot harder to deal with. So preventative and getting it planted correctly at the beginning is really key. So sometimes we'll get potted trees and we can actually see roots, sometimes bigger roots like this that are kind of encircling a little bit, or they might even get to the degree of this. And there's been more research now showing that if we just put that in the ground like that, that tree's going to have a really tough time to get out. So, up in Minnesota, they tried some research and they did this. They took that same tree and they cut 4 sides. They did what we call a box cut. And they actually cut off about 1 inch of all those roots on each side and squared that up and then planted it. And then they planted the trees that had the encircling roots. These slowed down a little bit the first year, but then they did a lot better than the ones with the encircling roots because those roots never got out. That seems like a very drastic method, and I can't believe I have to tell you to do that. But if you have encircling roots, I would really look at doing something like that, because right now if you don't, those trees are going to have a tough time developing with those circling roots down below. So before I talk about water, you get that tree in the ground, you awfully center it up, and then what you take from the ground, you put back in. So amendments, peat, good soil, all that stuff, especially if you have a bad soil or not a very good soil. If you put a lot of good stuff in that hole for a tree, those roots are going to want to stay there. So you're just making a big pot. If you can't amend your whole yard, then you shouldn't amend that hole. Now with shrubs and stuff, their roots aren't as extensive, smaller perennials. You could probably do some amending in, we do that with blueberries and stuff like that because we have to change the pH and different things. But with trees, those roots are in the top 2 feet of the soil, but they also can go twice the height of the tree. So if you have a 50-foot tree, you could have roots eventually 100 feet out. So amending that soil, if that's really good soil and it's not so good, once they get to the edge of the planting hole, those roots will often turn and stay in that hole. So you're just, again, putting them kind of in a pot in the ground. So what you take out, you put back in. And that's why making a wider hole can really help that tree develop. And then watering, this has actually kind of changed over the last couple of years with research. So I probably did one of these talks here 15 so years ago, and I used to say, water it really good and then let it dry out for 7 to 10 days. Now they say, water less and water more often. So the first year or so, you treat that tree like it's still in your nursery. And so you plant it and you basically water just around the root ball. So you don't water clear out in here. Notice she's got it pretty close to the trunk of the tree. You just water right in that spot. And for the first year, you just water that root ball. And you might water it 2 or 3 times a week, depending on your soils. Now, if you have a clay soil and you know that even a couple gallons is going to percolate right back up, you may only do it once or twice versus 3 times. But I usually give it a couple gallons each time I water it. So I'm going to water it that first year very religiously. And then going in the fall, I'm going to try to water it again so when the ground freezes, that root ball was pretty moist. We don't want to, if it's a dry freeze, it's not as good for the root system. And then the second year, I may start watering in the spring, and then I probably try to start weaning it off after the second year. And we'll talk about mulch, but if I have mulch, I'm going to need to water less. Now, if I have a tree, if we have a drought situation, and you planted a tree 3 years ago, and you watered the first 2 years, and then you stopped. In 2012, when we had a drought, we told people basically if they had planted a tree in the last 5 years, during the drought period, it'd be helpful to go back out and water that tree some during those drought situations. But usually once they get past that 5 years, the root systems are established. If they're going to live, they're going to live. But if you can wean it off going into the second year, try to do that. But basically what they say, for every inch of diameter you try to give it, or caliper, you try to give it 2 to 4 gallons each time you water for a tree. Then I realize in our yards we like to have grass, but the thing to remember is grass is a competitor. It's in the top, the roots are in the top 6 to 8 inches. They're in the same area where those tree roots are, so there's a lot of competition. The other thing is these cause a very severe condition, and it's called Homo sapien sapien weed whackus killis. Okay? The common name is Mower Blight. Okay? The thing you got to remember is the plumbing system of that tree is just underneath the bark. So here, even this nick has disturbed some of the water distribution and food distribution up and down that plumbing system of that tree. It's just underneath the bark. If you see green, you've damaged the vascular system of that tree if you nick it with the weed whacker or the mower or whatever. And these basically are old mower damage that eventually these don't, if they don't seal, they often get decayed. And long term, that could create a risk tree or a tree that could fall over. And so prevention is really critical. But I see a lot of trees in commercial areas where They don't control the mowing folks, and they're just destroying beautiful trees. And those trees, sometimes you can walk up to them and almost knock them off because they've been girdled so many times. They get a lot of this callus tissue and try to survive, but they don't. So mowers can cause, and weed whackers, even that string can cause significant damage. So mulch is a good thing. It's not perfect. You can get mold and mushrooms and different things that can grow out of there that may cause allergies and stuff like that. But generally, if you're going to mulch, I go 2 to 4 inches thick, and I pull it away from the trunk, but the further out I go, the better. I don't expect you to do like I have in my yard. I don't like grass, but they've done research that when trees are smaller, if you follow the edge of the branches, the drip line out, those trees grow a lot better compared to if you have one over here where you don't extend the mulch. Where you extend the mulch, those trees grow better. Again, I don't expect you to do that, but even if you do a 2 to 3 foot circle, especially for the first couple years, that conserves water, adds organic matter to the soil. I would avoid sawdust, grass, mulch, and stuff like that, but I'd use more fiber wood chips tend to work a little better. But you don't want to do this either. You don't want to mound it right up to the trunk because this is like adding more soil to the tree. So you got to be really careful not to over mulch. Okay. Sometimes we stake trees. My big message on staking is if you can avoid it, avoid it. If you plant that tree and it's stable, and what I do is if it looks pretty stable, I walk away from it. Come back in a couple days, and if it looks like you took a crowbar and that tree moved so much that it was actually moving the soil back and forth in the ball and the ball's moving, then you might want to stake it for a year. But if I stake it, I'm going to use some type of cloth or nylon or rubber, but I'm not going to use wire through a rubber hose because those are too stiff. But when I stake it, I'm going to stake it loose enough so when the wind blows, that tree moves some. I don't want it so tight that it can't move because it needs to build up its stability, and it builds up its stability with the wind blowing. I've seen situations where it's too tight and they leave it that way, and then 10 years later the tree snaps off where they had it staked. So you got to be careful. But if you can avoid it, I would actually avoid it. But if you need to do it, I would do it for about a year and use something softer and allow it to move some. But this is what happens when you leave the rubber hose on too long, or if you leave the strap on. The top of this tree is dead. And that's how we noticed there was a strap there. They were trying to help the tree and they left it on there too long. And that was a 10-year-old tree that died because they didn't get that off. So pruning. Going to talk briefly about that. Some of the things when to prune. There's a couple times I avoid. Spring, when we're getting new growth. Fall, color change. Most people say the best time to prune is during the dormant season, especially if you have oaks. If you have oak trees, you should only prune in like late November, December, January, and February. You should not prune oaks during the growing season at all. If you have to, because they got a broken branch or something like that, or the moving truck's coming in and you have to take that branch off, you cut that branch off and you put latex paint on that wound immediately, like within the first minute. Because there's a beetle that can carry a fungus called oak wilt to that open wound because it feeds on sap. And if it feeds on that wound, if it's a red oak, that tree could die in 6 weeks after that beetle arrives. So the best way to prevent oak wilt is not to prune oaks during the growing season, okay? But on other species like ash, maple, crabapples, pruning this time of year, actually some of the research is showing that the wounds close quicker. So when we cut a branch off, that tree does not heal. It seals. It puts a chemical barrier inside in 3 layers inside the tree, and then it grows new callus tissue that turns into bark and vascular system and seals that wound shut. You've seen the callus tissue before. Looks like a donut. If you do a good job, it'll close that wound. So we want to prune in a way to promote that. And they say on a lot of species, if you prune in June, or maybe even in July, you might get a little better response than if you prune it in the wintertime. But again, I still wouldn't do that on oaks, okay? So some of the things with young trees, especially shade trees, pruning weak branches, rubbing and crossing branches, especially like on crabapples and stuff, you'll get a lot of branches that tend to cross and rub. On shade trees like oak, maple, lindens, tulip poplar, elms, you want one straight leader. And if you start to get 2 leaders, you want to pick one of those off so you can train it to 1 leader. If you leave those 2, a lot of times they're V-shaped, and as they get bigger, they actually push apart, and this V-shape usually has a seam that can split the tree down. And it'll usually happen 25 years later. But if you prune that one 25 years before, you won't have that problem later. So you can really help. In the 98 windstorm, I saw so many trees that if they would have been pruned younger, a lot of those trees wouldn't have broken. I mean, there's a lot of trees, if the winds are really high, are still going to have problems, but we can really improve the structure and their defense to storms if we prune them correctly. There's a really good publication from Iowa State called Pruning Trees and Shrubs, and I'm just touching on some of the high notes because of the time tonight, but there's a good publication that talks about a lot of this stuff. Dead and sick branches, and then you might do clearance. I mean, if you're mowing or you want site clearance, you have to prune some branches up over time. So this is what I want you to think about. This is a 13-foot tree, okay? 6-foot person. All these branches, if this is in Iowa City, their regulations say they have to prune like up to 12 feet or 13 feet over the street and 8 feet over the sidewalk. Well, all these branches on this tree that's 13 feet will be removed in the life of that tree. That tree that was just planted, all those branches will be removed. So here's the process you need to think about. Is these branches grow from the tips this way, they get bigger in the trunk this way, but they get taller up this way. So they put on new wood like this. They don't stretch. So if you know that you need 8-foot clearance, all those branches in the first 8 feet of that tree you just planted are temporary branches that you're going to take off over time. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a pretty important concept to think about when you're looking at your trees. So again, this is about an 8-foot tree. The only thing that's going to be left is that main leader. If we need to clear to 8 feet, all these branches will eventually be gone. Okay? The thing I don't want you to do, though, is come in here some Sunday and cut 7 feet right away. Because if you take too much of that tree, you can really set it back. And I'll talk about it a little, but generally those lower branches, so if I have a tree like this, the first thing I look, do I have a straight leader? And if I have a double leader up here, I'll prune and fix that because that's going to be my permanent tree up there, okay? These branches I leave till they're about 1 inch, and then I usually get them off before they're 2 inches. What they say is you let them grow, and if you're going to prune temporary branches, you get them before they're half the diameter of the trunk. So if you have a 2-inch trunk, you should be pruning your branches at 1 inch that you're going to take off. Okay? If you have a 3-inch trunk, you get them before they get above 1.5 inches. But if you use that, kind of let them grow 1 inch and get them before they're 2 inches, by doing that, one thing with pruning is you want to minimize the size of wounds. The research is actually showing the smaller the wound that you make, the better that wound seals and the less decay we get in those wounds. That doesn't mean if you have a bigger branch and it's broken or something that you don't cut it, but the research shows the bigger those branches are, the more likely they are to get decay in them over time. So if you are starting from scratch and you can develop and determine what you're going to take, if you take those branches when they're smaller, you're going to have a lot less decay develop in that tree long term. Okay? Okay, so those key points. To me, about the first 5 to 25 years of that tree's life are pretty critical and kind of just like kids, training them, developing them, getting them going, then kick them out the door. Hopefully before 25 years. But so that doesn't mean at year 4 that you won't do some pruning. If I had a double leader, I don't wait till it gets 1 inch. I get that as small as I can and I get it off, so I'm training that 1 liter. If I have broken branches, I may do some pruning, but when I first plant, the more leaf material I can leave. The other thing I kind of use is I really want to leave, as long as I can, probably 75% of that tree and crown. That even means on big trees. If you take too much at one time, you can really set those trees back because they need leaves to produce the food that they use to survive. And then correct multiple leaders or weak connections. Identify the lowest branch in the permanent canopy, for like how high are you going to clear, and then leave those temporary branches till they're 1 inch and get them off before they're half diameter of the trunk. And then prune oaks during the dormant season. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with just a few trees, shade trees. I'm pretty close on time here.
You're fine.
Okay. Honeylocust is a decent shade tree, especially if you have a yard where you got some room. They're going to get 40 to 70 feet tall. If you have an area that you like to grow grass, they have a very kind of diffuse shade that allows some sunlight in. They do have little small leaflets that kind of get sucked in the doors, and people don't always like that. But the urban selections are thornless and podless. If you go out in the wild, they have big pods on them and they have big thorns out in the woods, but our urban selections don't. And there are some selections in the publication. So that's one decent, that's actually the Pedmal. They're pretty durable. They don't have a lot of insect and disease problems. They can have a few issues, but they're pretty tolerable to urban conditions. And again, this is just a few. There's the book I gave you. There's probably 30 or 40 different selections in there. It depends on your site. Again, here's my neighbor's red oak. I really like red oak. Has a nice fall color. But remember, it has acorns. You may not want that next to the house because once they start producing in 20 years, there's pretty big clangs and noises in the fall when those acorns drop. But something to think about. But they can make, if you have a bigger backyard or a bigger front yard and have some room, they can make a decent shade tree. I like oaks. Another one I like is Chinkapin. It's actually a native tree, but it's very big. It can get 60 to 75 feet tall, maybe have a 35 or 40 foot spread. So you would need a pretty big yard for this. Probably not the best as a street tree, but kind of a unique tree. Looks, grows a lot like big white, native white oak as far as its trunk and stuff like that. Here's one more oak that makes a decent urban tree, swamp white oak. Neither of the Chinkapin or the swamp have much for fall color. They're basically yellow. Kind of off brown, yellow. But the swamp does have on the developing bark, it gets kind of peely, not quite like a birch, but it's called exfoliating. It does peel, so it does have some winter characteristic to it too, a little bit. Ginkgo is actually a good urban tree. Very slow growing though. They'll get 50 to 60 feet tall, probably a 30 plus spread, but they're just really slow, but they make a really nice shade tree. There's some nice ones in the Pedmal that have been here a long time, very tough conditions, usually pretty adaptable and kind of open. They can allow some sunlight, but that's a street tree over on the east side. This is kind of a different one that people are starting. It's a native tree, Kentucky coffee tree. When you first plant it, it looks like a dead stick, and it takes it about 10 years before it actually starts looking like a tree. But it will, I promise. I planted one 3 years ago at the fairgrounds, and it's starting to look like a tree a little bit. But when we first planted, it just had some sprouts, and when you get them, they're kind of like sticks. But just give them some time, and they'll turn into a swan. They're a nice tree. Now, they can have seed pods, but I think there's at least one selection called espresso, I believe is podless. You'd have to check. Hackberry, not a bad shade tree, good urban tree, doesn't have a lot of big issues. Another, again, pretty good sized tree, more of a yellow fall color. We're starting to bring back some elms. There are some American selections now that are supposed to have some tolerance. I think there's a few listed in the book that I gave you. This is actually one at City High, still alive. There are some that have survived. And so they're actually starting to develop some. Now there's some hybrids out there too. I would avoid those, but the true American selections, there are some now that we can look back and maybe start planting some elms back. American linden, pretty big shade tree. The only challenge with this, if we have heavy populations of Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle loves this tree, and a number of years ago on the east side we had some pretty good populations, and it kind of made them turn brown. It won't kill them, but these are pretty fast growing and they'll get big, 60 plus, so you need a pretty good space. Tulip Poplar, kind of a unique one, has kind of a unique flower. This is actually the fruit, but the flower is kind of green, kind of unique. This is the leaf, looks like a tulip. Pretty fast growing tree, but get rather large. Again, you would need a pretty good space for those, but it's another alternative. A few small trees, redbud, but usually likes protected sites. These will get 15 to 25 feet tall. Again, this is just a few. These aren't necessarily my favorites either. There's a lot of options, but you go to Iowa State, they have good lists. There's actually a website called iowatreepest.com, and you go on there, it has alternatives to ash. There's a good list from Iowa State that has all kinds of different cultivars and varieties of different trees. Serviceberry, another one though, smaller tree, probably 15, 20 feet, has nice white flowers, has an edible fruit, has a pretty decent fall color, but likes east and northeast exposures. Not one that I would stick on the southwest side of the house. More of kind of a corner plant, closer to the house, kind of protected. And then there are crab apples. There's like 400 varieties of crab apples. But if you're going to get crab apples, there's different shapes, sizes, blossoms. But remember, the blossoms last 2 weeks, tops. But then they also produce fruit, which sometimes are good for wildlife. There's some that are yellow, some that are red, some that stay green. And again, there's different, you can get some as small as 8 feet tall, some as tall as 25 to 30 feet tall. Some shaped like a broom head, some that go straight up, some that are wide, a lot of selections. But the key with crab apples, they get a disease called apple scab. Make sure that they're tolerant to apple scab. There are still some selections out on the market that aren't, and if you look around in the next couple weeks, it's already starting, there's crab apples losing their leaves, it's because of apple scab. And every spring that we get these wetter springs, we get a lot of apple scab. But I have trees in my neighborhood that are dropping leaves, and there's a tolerant one right next to it. Will look perfect throughout the year. So the tolerance is really, really pretty good. If we have a really wet year, they may lose a few leaves, but the ones that are intolerant, usually by July 4th, a lot of them, or by August, they hardly have any leaves on them. They'll survive that. It's heavy defoliation, but they usually come back each year. And you can't really treat it. There's no really good way to treat it. So you buy selections that are tolerant to the disease. Okay, I'm done. I think I'm right on time. All right? Sure. Good. So we'll end there, I believe, right?
Sure. Or if we can.
Well, and I'll answer questions.
Yes. And we'll turn this on because if you ask your questions into the microphone, the people at home can hear your question.
Okay.
I get the first one because I have the mic. Can you think of a pagoda dogwood anywhere that I could go look at? Because I'm fascinated by them, but
some along, is it River Road that comes up from the university up from where the Hansher is and stuff that goes up the hill?
Up the hill toward
that's River,
toward
right?
The park, City
Yep.
Park.
That's not Park Road, but River Road's the next couple of roads over. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
By the new art building. Go up that. There's some in that neighborhood I've taken pictures of.
Okay.
They're another one, though, that likes kind of protected areas, like north, northeast, and they're going to get 15 to 25 feet tall.
Would being east of a giant silver maple qualify as protected?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they have a nice kind of reddish, kind of maroonish fall color, and they don't meet the typical dogwood. Dogwoods usually have what they call opposite branches, and these have alternate, so they have kind of layers. It kind of looks like an ornamental garden kind of tree. So they have kind of a layering that's kind of pretty.
That's what fascinated me with them in the picture.
But it's our only native dogwood tree in Iowa. All the other dogwoods are generally shrubs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question right away?
Okay.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, maybe, you were on Charity Nevy's show,
Yes.
and I heard you mention a black tupelo tree.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Now, a few years ago, we actually bought a black tupelo and a casutra tree,
Catasort. Yep. Yep.
but they were just sticks.
Okay.
Now, the black tupelo has died,
Okay.
and the other one is only like this tall.
Catsura. Yep.
Yeah. So, is there any place where you can actually buy these kind of trees that aren't just sticks?
Yeah, I mean, you look at local nurseries first, and a lot of times if you work with the local nursery and you want, another name for black tupelo is black gum.
Okay.
It's in your book. There's not a lot around town. There is a nice one, I believe, right across from Mercy Hospital, across from the emergency room in the right-of-way. And there's one out at the fairgrounds behind Montgomery Hall. But with the one at Fairgrounds Montgomery Hall, the top broke out, so it's kind of like a big shrub, but it's really pretty in the fall. It's got a reddish fall color, and they got a leaf that looks more like a rhododendron leaf or something, but it's real shiny. But I would check with local nurseries first, and a lot of times they can work with you to order, if they don't carry them. It may take a year or so, but a lot of times if you really want something, they can often order stuff for you. Versus going through catalogs and stuff and getting another stick through the mail. If you work with local nurseries, a lot of times if they don't carry it, they can work with you, or they may even give you another nursery where you could find one. Okay.
I'll just work my way back.
How do you determine the soil pH, and then what do you do with that information once you have it?
So there are some test kits that you can use in your garden that you go to garden stores and stuff you can buy, and I think they can give you a general where you take a little bit of soil, you pour it on, and it changes colors. Or you can also take soil samples and work with Extension, and they can send them to a lab over there, especially like for gardens and stuff or areas. And they have a bag, and they tell you that you're supposed to take so many samples, you put it in a bucket, and I think you mix it up, and then you take samples and put that in the bag. And then they'll give you a general pH, nitrogen, phosphorus, and stuff like that. The thing that pH is so critical, there are some species, so on pH, the scale, basically 7 is neutral, below is acidic, and above is alkaline or basic. And there are some species that if you give above 7, like pin oak, red maple, sometimes even swamp oak, they'll have nutrient problems or nutrient deficiencies. The big thing with pin oaks, if the pH gets above 7, they often get chlorotic or yellow, and it's because of deficiency in iron. It's not that there's not enough iron in the soil, but because the pH is higher, it's unavailable to that tree and they can't pick it up. And then those trees turn yellow, and a lot of times, if they're not treated with a form of iron that they can pick up, they'll decline in health. With red maples, there's one called manganese, that if the pH is too high, it becomes unavailable, and they'll get yellowish and chlorotic. If you look at some of the trees in the Pedmullen areas, and there was one by Oak Capitol, I think has died now, but it was in a very tough situation, and they turned yellow and chlorotic and decline. So there's some certain species that are very sensitive to that pH. So if you wanted a red maple or a pin oak, you'd want to make sure that you got the general pH tested to see if you're even in the ballpark to even plant a species like that.
So do you want to do this before you're choosing your trees, or do you choose your trees and then change the soil to?
Well, the problem is it's really hard. The question was out there in TV land was, can you change the soil? And what I would do is probably, if in general, I might just get a general test first, see what the pH of my soil in the area is, and then select trees. Because it's almost impossible for a yard situation to modify the pH. You can use things like elemental sulfur and stuff like in a garden maybe, in a smaller area, but the soil has such a buffering capacity, you'll never be able to fix it in a larger area. So then if you know what the pH, there are some species that are more adaptable to higher pHs versus ones that are not. Good questions. Yes?
Hi, I had two questions.
Okay.
How does the emerald ash borer physically get from, one tree to a tree that might be a couple miles away? How is it moving
Great question.
west,
So the way it's moving is it can fly in the research maybe up to a mile and maybe a little farther in the lab. But the other way it's moving is us. So the way it's really moved across the United States, because there's a population out in Fort Collins, Colorado right now. And there's nothing in between us and Fort Collins. It didn't fly out there. So it got out there through wood. So it got out there through firewood, in most cases firewood. And in the early years, in Michigan and stuff, there's a lot of wholesale nurseries in Michigan. And because it don't kill the tree right away, there was nursery stock coming out of some of those states in the Northeast United States down to other places that the trees looked healthy, but they planted them, and then 5 years later, all the trees around had emerald ash borer. They actually came out of those infested nursery stock. They haven't had nursery stock of ash for probably 8 years plus, so that's not a problem. But people are moving firewood. Uncle Joe goes, lives in Michigan, is invited to Iowa. He's in charge of firewood, doesn't know that he shouldn't be bringing it, brings it in. I mean, there's been advertisements and all that, but we know even in our communication times, people don't see everything, and so it moves. The other way it could be moving is even attaching to cars, campers, different things, or even railroads, and kind of hitchhiking, and when it stops, jumps off. I found, I think, we haven't confirmed it, but there's a area, we found it in Lisbon, we haven't found it in Mount Vernon yet, but just west of Mount Vernon, there's a place where the rail stops, where the trees stop, or where the train stops and sits, because the track splits up ahead, and they have to wait for them to get through. And I started walking through that woods about 2 months ago, and all the ash, there was chips all over the ground. The woodpeckers had just been peeling everything. And the guy says, the train stops right there, Mark, every day, a couple times a day. I think there's a possibility that maybe they hitchhiked. There's been no proof of some of that stuff, but the firewood's probably been the thing that's got the most attention, is people are moving it from state to state. Now, Iowa, a year or two ago, had a quarantine that you couldn't take firewood out of 23 counties or whatever and go west. Now the whole state is quarantined federally, so you can move firewood anywhere in the state of Iowa legally. We do not recommend it. So if you're going to cut down ash trees, try to burn it locally, take it to the landfill locally, do whatever, chip it locally, keep it local. Don't take it out to Council Bluffs, don't take it other places. But legally you can. You can't take it, though, out of Iowa into non-quarantine states, because then you'd actually be breaking a federal law.
Oh, and just one more question.
Yes.
I just planted for my mom a baby Australian pine, or Austrian pine. Any advice about watering or special advice?
This is going to sound really tough, but I would dig that tree up and plant something else. Yeah. I'm honest. So if it's a true Austrian pine, once they start producing cones, which is about 10 to 12 years, they get all kinds of different diseases, and they start to decline and have problems. I can show you sick Austrian pines all over town. So if it's a feasible thing, I would think if it's room where pines could grow, I would think about a white pine maybe, or a Norway spruce, or a Serbian spruce, or a larch. There's a really nice larch on campus across from the campus bookstore, but it's a deciduous, it'll look green like a pine tree all year, and then it drops its needles in the fall. But I would honestly think about not using that. And just know in maybe 15 years, you're probably going to have problems, to be honest. Sorry, but that's the truth. We in general, I probably haven't recommended Austrian pine for 20 years because of all the disease issues, if it's truly.
Well, I didn't see it listed very many.
Right. But if you don't have any options and that's it, water it, take care of it like we said, but understand that you know, and the problem is once it produces cones, one of the diseases that causes the problem, it overwinters on the cones. And so it usually doesn't become a problem until it starts producing cones, which takes about 10 to 15 years to get to that point. But if you have other Austrians in the neighborhood that have any diseases, those spores can move and infect that tree too. Okay, you're welcome. Yes, one more?
Yeah, I have two questions, if it's possible to
Sure.
First, on your pruning slide, you mentioned weak connections. What are
Yes.
those? And how do you identify them?
So, believe it or not, if you have a branch and this is the trunk and this is the branch coming, this is a strong connection. The wider this angle, the stronger it is. The more it starts going like this, the weaker it is. You actually would think it'd be the other way around, but usually in this case, this is all wood. And as you get up here, notice how there's a seam there, and usually from here to here, that's a true seam, and that's bark against bark, and you'll get a lot of decay. So if you look at trees that have had wind damage and stuff, and if you look at the trunk a lot of times, where it splits off, you'll see kind of a brown area above, and then you'll see the wood below. That's what they call included bark. So that's a weaker connection. So when those are smaller, if I see those weak connections, I prune them off before they're an inch. I don't wait for that inch. If I see these bad, weaker connections, I take them right off first. So actually, if you think about apple trees, a lot of times, they'll actually take spreaders and they'll widen them out and spread them because that angle can actually hold more load.
So the closer it is to 90 degrees, the stronger it is. But
Correct.
So a rule of thumb, no pun, but so once if it gets shorter than say 45 degrees, maybe 30 degrees, then
Well,
probably
here's the
pretty weak.
critical thing though. It's really important to know what the natural characteristic of the tree is before you start pruning. A great example is little leaf linden. If you look at little leaf lindens, every angle is like this. They're very compact and they have very weak angles. You'd prune everything off, you wouldn't have anything left.
Okay.
So it's important to know what the normal characteristic of that tree is. Here's the other thing that you look for. If it's not a tree that has those typical weak angles, another one that has that is a lot of the ornamental pears, like Bradford pear that they used to use and stuff, had a lot of those weak angles. The other thing to look for is if you have a good connection here, there's usually a ridge of bark in the middle. If I can see that ridge of bark coming through the middle, that usually means that that's pretty strong and this is all wood. If I start to see that seam, so I would say the closer I get to 45, then those would be ones that I would start to take. But even if it's like that and I can see a ridge,
Okay.
that's still a pretty strong connection.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah. One second question. We were ones who had took the route of knocking down our ash trees last
Okay.
year. We had two in our backyard. They were getting very sickly.
Okay?
And one of them was telephone pole.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're probably about, 20 feet apart, the stumps, or we haven't ground them down yet.
Okay.
But we want to plant a new tree there. So when you have big, thick stumps, you want to plant a new tree, how far away do you need to be away from the existing stumps without it being crowded?
I would say you could go as few as a couple feet. If you start digging and there's not a lot of roots there and you can dig a good hole, you could go a couple feet, or you might have to go up to 5 to get.
Okay.
But the roots are no good anymore, so you can cut them out.
Well, they
could cut
can. You can use a stump grinder, but the thing that I would have, or yeah, you could actually physically, but that's a lot of work. I mean, you could get a stump grinder, though. There's even stump grinders that they can push through the back gate that are small enough that will take and grind that down below ground,
Yeah.
and then you can get grass reestablished. But even if you do that, I wouldn't plant right where it was before. Even if you can rip it all out, which if it was a huge tree, that would just take lots of work. But I would move a couple feet one way or the other, and then just do some prodding, and if it's digging, you can go a couple feet away. But, I mean, the other option is, in that case, if a tree right in the middle would look good and you're only going one, I might just pick the middle. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I've got about 12 ash trees.
Okay.
And there's 4 of them that I would really like, that I'm going to treat.
Okay.
I'm going to treat. The other ones, am I better off to have those removed or just wait and see?
Well, the wait and see is they are going to die. I mean, pretty much, probably a 99.95% chance. The challenge is thinking about, can you afford to have them all removed in 1 year or, over a short period of time? If you can, you could wait. The other thing you get a little concerned about is when things start dying a lot, folks are going to get a lot busier. So what you might do, one thing to think about is you could spread it out. You could watch them, and if they, one starts to decline over the other, then you say, okay, it's time to take this one down this year. Next year, I'm going to take the next one, and the other two seem okay so far, so I'm going to wait a little longer. But once they start to thin a little bit, then maybe. But it's really hard to guess, but if you're in the Iowa City area, I think within the next 5 to 10 years, things are going to get uglier. And so I think it's going to, again, a big tree is probably not going to die in 1 year, but they're going to die a lot quicker. So you have to decide, can I deal with removing multiple trees in a shorter period of time? And if you can't, then you may want to, the other option is to say, okay, we're going to take one down now. We're going to wait a couple years. If they're looking okay, then we'll maybe take another one down, and then we'll just start taking them. But
That's what I was thinking I would do.
and that's okay. You just have to be able to be aware, though, that they might start to go downhill pretty quick. Once things pick up a little bit, then you might have to go quicker.
Now, one of the things you talked about with the ash trees,
Okay?
in deciding whether or not to treat,
Okay?
the one thing you didn't mention was the age of the tree. Because I have an old
Right.
ash tree. If it were a younger tree and it was still in really good shape, I would treat it.
Right.
At what point is it not worth treating an ash tree that's that big around?
I actually did mention that. I said that the lifespan was 40 to 70 years.
So now I have to do the math. So now I have to do the
Right,
math
so now you gotta do
to
the math.
figure out.
But here's the other thing to think about, is I've had situations where people say, well, my tree is getting to that age, but I had an arborist look at it, and so far it looks healthy and everything. And if that tree means a lot to that person, and it's healthy at this point, then you want to start treating, you could still treat it. I mean, the thing is to think about, too, is you can always stop treating, too. I mean, you have a bigger tree and maybe you extend it 4 years and you go, well, now it's 72 years old. What, and it's maybe starting to thin a little bit, well, maybe it's time to take it out. But to me, even if it's older and it's super healthy, and an arborist can look at it and say, well, like on my tree, if I get that much growth every year, I'm lucky. For an ash tree, that's not good growth at all. And it has some other things that I'm seeing that I know it's really slowing down. So for me, it's an easy decision. But there may be, and there are some out there that if you're getting really good growth every year still, and you can look at the new growth and say, wow, it's getting 10, 12 inches, it's growing good, it doesn't have any defects or anything. The biggest thing that I often find is on older trees, a lot of times they have decay or a bad connection that the landowner doesn't see or whatever, and then that answers it right away. If it has any defects that create a risk, I'm not even going to think about it, especially if it's an older tree. And if it's a younger tree, though, with defects, I'm still probably not going to treat that tree, because if it's got that bad connection, and I know in 10 years it could split in the next storm, it's probably not worth investing that kind of money to save it. So if it's healthy and it's older, but it's got none of those things, if you want to try it, you could still treat. So it's really there's not a really good answer that, hey, when it gets 65, you shouldn't even try it. Because like I said, there's always exceptions to the generalization I gave. You may get trees that are 70, 80 years old still looking pretty good. Especially if it's in a nice yard, good soils, good environment, it might be all right.
I have one other question.
Okay.
Do oak trees have single leaders? Or are they the kind that don't really have a leader?
Most oak trees have single leaders, but oak trees can get birds, crows, and stuff that will sit up there. Something may break it and create two, or they can, but most oak trees will have a central leader. There is an exception. There are some urban varieties that are upright, and they look like little like little poles. They have all kinds of multiple leaders.
In front of the Masonic building,
Okay.
they planted 2 oak trees.
Right.
And one, you can't tell from here, but one, I've always thought either it has triple leaders or it's just a really strange tree. So,
There's some new selections, some hybrids that are more columnar that have, that's their form. So you need to know what the selection is to know. But most, like red oaks, white oaks, bur oaks that aren't hybrids and stuff, usually have 1 leader. Yeah. But they can develop double leaders, so that's why you want to watch them over time to prune them. Okay.
anyone else? Well, oh, you have one more. And you'll keep talking as long as we keep asking. So.
Jane has a maple tree that's not quite straight up.
A what tree?
A maple.
Okay.
It's not growing quite straight up.
Okay.
It's probably 4 or 5 inch diameter. It's
Okay.
not huge, but is there a way to pull that to make it grow straight, or
Do you know why it's not growing straight up?
No, it was that way when we bought the house.
Okay. Is there any other trees by it?
There's an ash tree,
Okay.
probably 10 feet.
So you think that the top is kind of growing like this because of the shade? Because like on my oak, the ash trees here, my oaks here, my oak tree, the trunk is straight, but then the top kind of goes out like this. Is it doing that? Or is it more the whole trunk?
All the way to the ground. Looks
Okay.
like it comes out of the ground, and it's. I guess if you cut it off, it would look like it was straight, but as it comes out of the ground, it's angular.
Oh,
rather
so it's
than-
kind
rather
of,
than
it's
straight
just
up.
in the ground, it's kind of sitting like this.
Yeah.
Is the top now straightening out itself? It's all kind of, can you move it?
No, it's
It's pretty big.
Probably 4 or 5 inch diameter, I suppose, maybe 4.
A tree like that, you
Not
wouldn't
huge.
be able to adjust it. But what I would suggest is, I'll give you my card. Send me some digital pictures. Let's just look at it and see if there's any other concerns. I mean, because a lot of times if a tree is, like on my oak tree, it's tilted, but it's tilted because of the sun. I'm not concerned about that structurally or anything. It'll be fine because it actually develops. But if it's a tree that's tilted and maybe it wasn't planted correctly or something like that, or it's still too deep, then I'd be concerned later on that that might be an issue.
Thank you.
But if I look at the digital pictures, maybe we can figure something out. Okay,
Thank you.
all right.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mark, once again.